Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this critically important issue. Let me be clear. Jeopardising UNRWA's mandate and in turn its ability to carry out life-saving work is unacceptable. As my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, stated clearly in this House yesterday, it is also wholly counterproductive for Israel. Removing UNRWA from the equation would make an already unacceptable humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories far worse. It also undermines, of course, the work of the United Nations more widely. We are working closely with our international partners to urge the Israeli government to step back from the brink and ensure that the legislation passed yesterday in the Knesset does not stop UNRWA being able to carry out its vital role in the OPTs. UNRWA is indispensable in the provision of aid for Palestinians. No other agency can get aid into Gaza at the scale needed. All humanitarian actors depend on UNRWA's distribution network to get aid to those who need it most. That's why we restored funding to UNRWA as soon as possible, providing £21 million of funding. This is helping to provide emergency food, shelter and other support for 3 million people, as well as supporting UNRWA's wider work assisting 6 million Palestinian refugees across the region. £1 million of the UK's funding is helping the implementation of Catherine Colonna's reforms. We expect UNRWA to uphold the highest standards of neutrality. As I've said, we are providing funding and support for its reform process to enable this. The Secretary-General and the Commissioner-General of UNRWA took these allegations seriously and acted decisively. They cannot now be used to justify cutting ties with UNRWA. That's why we and our international partners voiced our concern at the weekend about the legislation which the Knesset has now passed and called on the Government of Israel to make sure UNRWA's work can continue. The Prime Minister has been clear. The world will not tolerate further excuses from Israel on humanitarian assistance. They must enable more aid to enter Gaza now and to protect civilians. There can be no justification for denying civilians access to essential supplies. It's unacceptable that UK-funded humanitarian supplies have been unable to reach those in desperate need. Winter's coming and the Palestinian people cannot wait. Israel's Foreign Minister, Katz, reassured the Foreign Secretary over the weekend that aid will get in, while we will continue to press Israel to meet those commitments. The Foreign Secretary, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, reported to this House yesterday that Foreign Minister Katz had told us that the Knesset passing its bill did not necessarily mean it had to be implemented. We will continue to use every lever we have to put pressure on the Israeli government not to implement this legislation. It's not in its own interest, and it's certainly not in the interest of the Palestinian people, nor indeed of humanity. Thank you.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for that statement and also welcome the comments made by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary yesterday. But our statement of concerns will do nothing to help the lives of innocent Palestinians who will be further devastated by this decision. The Minister will know that the decision was backed yesterday by 90% of the Knesset. It will see UNRWA evicted from the premises it has held for over 70 years and severely block its ability to provide essential services such as healthcare and education to millions of Palestinian refugees and others. It is a reckless move and one that threatens to dismantle the backbone of the international humanitarian operation in Gaza, worsening an already catastrophic crisis. It will also deprive them of essential food, water, medical aid, education and protection, which is already being obstructed. But it also will have a catastrophic consequence for millions of Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon, Jordan and Syria, where essential humanitarian aid is crucial for both the refugees and the host communities as well. It is clear these actions are part of a wider strategy to delegitimize UNRWA and to undermine the international legal framework protecting their right, specifically the right of return for Palestinian refugees who have been languishing in surrounding countries. Does the Minister agree with me that the real intent is part to undermine UNRWA and efforts to uphold the status of Palestinian refugees and obstruct future political solutions? Can I also remind the Minister that the ICJ ordered Israel to take all measures within its powers to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention? And by banning UNRWA's operation, Israel is disregarding the ICJ's provisional measures to ensure delivery of life-saving aid into Gaza. So can I ask her final question, which is, we've seen the decimation that has taken place. Is there not time now to fulfil Part 2 of the Balfour Agreement? We have the State of Israel. Should we not have now a State of Palestine?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for her comments, and indeed I'm aware that she is someone who's had considerable direct experience of the importance of UN organisations before she became a member in this place. I agree with her that we cannot see the undermining of UNRWA. It does have a specific role, of course, one that is long-standing, one that is provided within that clear framework that countries, of course, signed up to, and not just a role within Gaza, but one also in West Bank and the broader region as well. And she is, of course, right about the fact that UNRWA is critical for the delivery of aid, also when it comes to the operation of other organisations as well. As members would expect, I have discussed this not just with General Lazzarini and with other of his leadership within UNRWA itself, including when I was in Jordan, but also with other organisations that are active in Gaza as well. They are very clear that we should not see that undermining of UNRWA, that ultimately it is critical to the delivery of much needed humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Opposition spokesperson, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We're following developments in the Knesset carefully. On these benches, we want more aid to reach innocent civilians in Gaza because the situation there is desperate. But we also recognise that UNRWA must rebuild the trust and confidence that it lost following the deeply troubling allegations that staff were involved in the appalling October 7th attacks and the outcome of the subsequent investigation. Catherine Colonna's reforms need to be implemented in full because we also recognise that UNRWA has a good, indeed often critical distribution network. Can the Minister update the House on what progress UNRWA has made on implementing the Colonna reforms and what measures the government has put in place since restoring funding to UNRWA to monitor its neutrality? More broadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, during our time in government, Israel made commitments to increase the amount of aid reaching Gaza, including, for example, allowing the delivery of humanitarian aid through Ashdod and Erez, extending the opening hours of Kerem Shalom, increasing the total number of aid trucks and allowing more types of aid in. I'd be grateful if the Minister could update the House on what discussions she's had with her Israeli colleagues about fulfilling those commitments and indeed what credible alternative plan Israel has developed. Despite the pause on future funding to UNRWA that was implemented by the last government, we remained absolutely committed to getting on with aid delivery. Amongst other measures, we assisted over 5,800 children with severe malnourishment and 853,000 children, adolescents and carers with wider emergency services. We also sent in many airdrops and we funded a field hospital treating thousands of patients. So can the Minister confirm that there are other ways that exist to deliver aid without UNRWA and that the UK stands ready to help in every way possible with its extensive expertise to reach the most vulnerable?
Very good.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her comments. She raised a number of critically important issues. First of all, I was pleased to see cross-party agreement on the subject of the need, the desperate need, in fact, for more aid to be entering Gaza. Also, we would agree that the Colonna reforms, of course, need to be implemented, but the new UK government has been very clear that we will do what we can to ensure that is the case. £1 million of the support that we provided to UNRWA indeed is dedicated to ensuring that those reforms are implemented. We continue to monitor that situation actively, and as she would expect, I have discussed this directly with the leadership of UNRWA, and I believe they are putting those measures in place. They have put many in place, indeed many measures that for a long time they had wished to put into place but were unable to do so for lack of funds. So that is critically important. She referred to comments that had been made previously by Israel. Well, of course, the government of Israel did state that it would flood Gaza with aid. Concerningly, however, we are seeing currently that October may be the month where we will have seen the lowest levels of aid going into Gaza since the start of the conflict. So there really does need to be action to change this. We have seen a very strong message on this coming right across government, of course from myself, also from the Foreign Secretary and indeed from the Prime Minister. We need to see a change here. I would, however, question perhaps some of her final comments, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker. All of the organisations that I have discussed these matters with, from a whole range of different perspectives when it comes to the delivery of aid, have stressed the critical role that UNRWA provides. It does have an unrivalled ability to distribute the support that is so desperately needed, and that is, if anything, even more important as we approach winter, which could be very difficult indeed for the people of Gaza unless we act. Thank you.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Speaker. UNRWA staff are required to uphold neutrality, to receive compulsory training on humanitarian principles. It shares staff names and ID numbers with host countries. It has its 1,300 buildings inspected quarterly, and it has commissioned a report led by the former Foreign Secretary in France, who concluded that UNRWA upholds the principle of humanitarian neutrality. Whilst, of course, there are changes that can be made, does my right honourable friend agree that the recommendations are relatively peripheral and that fundamentally UNRWA should and does deserve the trust of the international community?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her comments and, of course, for all the work that she is undertaking in her Select Committee on these issues. We would state, as the new UK government, that we were appalled by the allegations that those involved in the 7th October attacks against Israel may have included UNRWA staff. It was absolutely right that those investigations took place within UNRWA to determine what had happened, and that there was then decisive action. We believe that was fundamental. Actually, it was incredibly important that that happened. She rightly referred to Catherine Colonna's report. That does underline the need for neutrality, and I mentioned previously the fact that the UK government has been determined to play our part in ensuring that Colonna is implemented, including allocating £1 million to that end. And we are very clear that the kind of change that we could see around the position on UNRWA recently cannot be linked to discussions around the Colonna report. There has been that decisive action that's been taken, decisive action that the UK government has supported, and UNRWA is needed to support humanitarian aid right now in Gaza.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are deeply concerned about the Knesset's vote to ban UNRWA. This comes at a time that could not be more desperate. One of the UN's most senior humanitarian officials warns that the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. So we welcome the government's continued support to UNRWA, including to implement the recommendations of the Colonna report as quickly as possible. Can the Minister state what confidence she has in the assurance the Foreign Secretary received from Foreign Minister Katz that the Israeli government was not obliged to implement the Knesset's decision? Can the Minister set out what the government is precisely doing to achieve immediate access for humanitarian aid? And will the Minister agree with me that, as well as words of condemnation, the UK must set out the consequences for breaching international law? And will she consider sanctioning Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich for their incitement of violence against Palestinians by illegal settlers in the West Bank?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his comments, and indeed I believe that we are of the same mind when it comes to the position on the passing of the UNRWA bills by Israel's Knesset. The Prime Minister, in fact, has been very clear that the UK is gravely concerned about this. We believe that the passing of those bills risks making UNRWA's essential work for Palestinians impossible. It risks jeopardising the entire international humanitarian response in Gaza and indeed the delivery of essential health and education services in the West Bank. And of course we've joined with allies in making that very clear indeed over the weekend and into the beginning of this week. And that did, as he mentioned, include the Foreign Secretary reiterating his deep concern to Israel's Foreign Minister Katz on the 27th of October. He made that very clear, the UK's concerns around this. Now, he asked about what immediate action we are taking, Madam Deputy Speaker, around access to aid. We are using every lever that we can identify to try and progress that access. I mentioned before our deep concern about the situation currently where we see far too few trucks entering Gaza with the supplies that are desperately needed. That's particularly important now in the run-up to winter. We will continue to work multilaterally and bilaterally to try and push forward on this. And then finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, he mentioned the important subject of international humanitarian law. The new UK government is resolutely committed to international humanitarian law. When it comes to sanctions, of course, we keep our sanctions regime continuously under review. I will not comment on the specifics of it now for reasons that he will, of course, understand. We have been very clear that the actions of those engaged in promoting illegal settlements and violence towards Palestinians on the West Bank is completely unacceptable. We have stated that many times and made that clear. And finally, in terms of whether there are implications from this position, I would refer him to the discussions we had in the House around the arms export licence and control regime previously. Thank you.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My right honourable friend said at the beginning that we've had an end now to Israeli excuses about why aid doesn't get in. But this is beyond excuses, isn't it? This is potentially an act of deliberate policy to destroy the most effective aid route into Gaza. That's what it is. So what are we actually going to do about it if Israel continues to ignore the requests and the pleas that we make to them? I come back to the issue of sanctions. If Israeli ministers decide to implement this bill, aren't they effectively engaging in an act of warfare by starvation? This is a breach of humanitarian law. Are we therefore going to take sanctions against those Israeli ministers who get involved in promoting this policy?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the important points that he has raised, and there is no doubt that there will be very severe consequences if the work of UNRWA is indeed obstructed. We've already talked about this within this debate. It's very clear that it's only UNRWA that has the depth of reach that is required to get the aid needed to those in such desperate need within Gaza. We do not believe there is any justification for the position that has been taken. We've been very clear about that as the UK government. We have articulated that not only bilaterally, but also, of course, with our partners. We did that immediately over the weekend. So the position of the UK government is very clear on this. And when it comes to sanctions, he will understand that no UK government announces exactly what it is doing around sanctions. That is appropriate and correct. We will always keep our sanctions policies under review, as this House would expect.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Whether or not UNRWA is compromised, the fact remains that the Knesset and quite possibly the Israeli government believe that it is, and without Israel, no aid gets through. Therefore, what measures does she think needs to be taken to improve aid resilience in this conflict and others so that we're not over-reliant on one agency? And what plan B is she working on to ensure UK aid is channelled through alternative agencies?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question, but the UK government has been clear. UNRWA has that clearly mandated role, one not just in relation to Gaza, but also to the West Bank and the broader region. It's had that role indeed for many years. That is something that has been very clear within the international community, and the role of the UN in general is one that is incredibly important, one that is internationally supported. So it really is critical that role of UNRWA is not being undermined when it does play such an important part, both constitutionally, if I may say so, and internationally, as well as indeed when it comes to the delivery of aid. Of course, we will do all that we can to make sure that support reaches those who need it. But ultimately, it is UNRWA that is the body that has the greatest reach, and that is needed now when we see such an extent of humanitarian need.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Israeli government's banning of UNRWA is a blatant and cruel disregard for human life. Without access to necessities that only UNRWA can provide, such as food and medicine, thousands of innocent Palestinians are facing malnourishment, disease and death. Given Netanyahu has shown no interest in supporting legitimate human rights organisations, no interest in a ceasefire and no interest in a two-state solution, I am grateful our government has given a clear commitment to recognising the State of Palestine. So will the Minister tell us what we can expect, when we can expect the recognition of the State of Palestine and a pathway to getting to that point?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these issues. Just very briefly to state that the decision that we saw recently was of the Knesset, so it's a parliamentary decision, as it were, rather than one by the Israeli government. But we are very concerned about its consequences, as we have been discussing. We do believe, as the UK government, that we must see a ceasefire, we need to see the release of hostages, we need to see immediate delivery and access to aid throughout Gaza. It's incredibly important, and we do continue to believe and to advocate strongly for the two-state solution that is so desperately needed, that will provide the security and stability that is needed both for Israelis and indeed for Palestinians. Thank you.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel is once again choosing to block aid to a civilian population that it is bombing. It is sinister and it is collective punishment. So can the Minister outline a single red line that Israel can cross that would lead her to question their status as an ally of the United Kingdom?
The new UK government has been absolutely clear, as I stated previously in my remarks, that international humanitarian law must be upheld. And the member, I'm sure, was in the House when we had those debates that talked, for example, about the fact that we need to ensure that the International Criminal Court's mandate is respected, that the role of the International Court of Justice is also respected, and he will have, I'm sure, been present for debates around the UK government's position on arms exports, where we believe it's really important that international law is held to, and this government has been delivering on that.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The situation in northern Gaza is dire. I welcome the leading role the government has played in providing essential humanitarian aid for Gaza, including through the support packages for UNRWA, UNICEF, UK Med, the WHO and the DEC appeal. Does the Minister agree with me that the ongoing Israeli restrictions on the flow of essential aid are completely unacceptable and should be lifted immediately?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these important issues, and we do believe that any restriction on aid is unacceptable. It is incredibly important that we see access to the water and sanitation services that's desperately needed, also to food, to shelter as well, particularly important as winter approaches. And he was right to mention the situation in northern Gaza, which is particularly concerning. The UK government will continue to do all that we can to advocate for more aid to get into Gaza. Thank you.
Simon Hall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With 90% of the Knesset voting for the bill yesterday, it's surely naive to suggest that this bill will not be enacted, and so therefore other preparations need to be made. And despite the very strong urgings of the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU and others, the Israeli Parliament voted for the bill, knowing full well what the collective international view was towards that proposal. Does the government now realise that the Israeli government, and indeed Parliament, is effectively diplomatically flying solo when it comes to these issues? And if, as we all believe, there is no other agency that can step in at pace and at scale to deliver the aid which is clearly needed, then as the leader of the SNP, an unlikely bedfellow for me, said, is this now not verging on the definition of collective punishment, and the government can no longer just either wring its hands or urge?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for his comments. We are very clear that the role of UNRWA here is essential, not only because of its reach and its depth, but also because, of course, it has that clear UN mandate, as I spoke about before, not only in Gaza, also in the West Bank and in the wider region. Indeed, I've discussed this issue with counterparts from Lebanon too. It really is important. We do not see it being undermined. That is critical for the UK government. Now, we have joined with allies, as he rightly mentioned, in expressing our deep concern about this. We will continue to push very hard on this indeed, because we understand what the consequences are if there is not continued ability for UNRWA to operate. We know the impact both on those in humanitarian needs, but also on the UN's role more broadly. And I think that message really couldn't be coming across more clearly from the UK government.
Ruth Cadbury. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under international law, Palestinian refugees will retain their right to return. By seeking to dismantle UNRWA, Israel could be pressurising Palestinians as part of a wider plan for those Palestinian refugees to relinquish their rights to return. So despite concerns and pleading to Israel, the Knesset, by our Foreign Secretary and governments of many other countries, the Knesset went ahead with this vote. So what additional pressure will the UK government be applying to Israel, who continue to violate international law and breach the UN Charter in these ways?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not going to speculate about the reasons behind the decision of another Parliament. I don't believe that would be appropriate. What we have to be clear about, however, is the UK government's response to this, and that has been very clear, as we've talked about already for some time in this debate. We do not accept that decision. We believe it is the wrong one. We believe it's only UNRWA that can deliver the aid that is desperately needed. We will continue to advocate for that very, very clearly. And of course, that is critically needed as well when we see the extent of displacement that has taken place within Gaza. Now, very large numbers of people in Gaza who've been moved, not just once or twice, but in some cases 9 or 10 times. So the UK government will continue to push very strongly on these issues.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If this bill is an indication of how Israel now sees international treaties and international law, then surely there is no point in further negotiations with regards to a free trade agreement with Israel. Should we not just end these negotiations now?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I stated before, I'm not going to speculate on the activities of another Parliament, but I am going to be very clear about the UK government's response to this, particularly when it comes to the potential humanitarian impact. Others may wish to discuss trade issues, but actually for me as Development Minister, the most important thing here is how we can ensure that access to aid for those who are so desperately in need within Gaza, and that's what I will continue to focus on, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Minister says, with winter on its way, it is vital we are clear about the importance of aid and challenging all who obstruct it. The Israeli Finance Minister said that the starvation of 2 million people in Gaza might be justified and moral to free the hostages. Let us be clear, the hostage families do not think that. The National Security Minister backed the protests against aid convoys reaching Gaza. I understand the Minister says that she will not give a running commentary on sanctions, but if not sanctions now, at this point, what else is open to us to send a clear message that aid must get to Gaza immediately?
Well, I do, Madam Deputy Speaker, most definitely share the deep concern and rejection of the truly appalling comments that she has just referred to. We are very clear about the fact that those comments were completely unacceptable. We could not have been clearer. Now, some of the opposition have suggested that a sanctions regime should be in opposition to taking action around the legal regime on arms exportation. Actually, we believe, as the UK government, that we need to keep all of these issues under review, as indeed the House would expect for us to fulfil our legal requirements, and that is why we announced those changes to arms export licences earlier a few months ago. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The run-up to the vote in the Knesset, of course, was last Thursday, UNRWA confirming that their employee, Mohammed Abu Atawi, actually led the attack on Kibbutz Rahim, where the British national, Anna Shapira, was brutally murdered after he'd thrown back 7 grenades to those attacking him. He was killed by the 8th. So given those circumstances, what assessment has been made by the government of the involvement, direct involvement of UNRWA employees in the attack on October the 7th, and until they are rooted out, those individuals that are involved in that, of course, there is mistrust in UNRWA to deliver the aid that we want to see in. So will she take that action?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the UK government has been very clear. UNRWA must meet the highest standards of neutrality. That was, of course, laid out in Catherine Clonagh's report. And as I mentioned before, Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK government has provided financial support to ensure that UNRWA is taking those actions to the tune of £1 million. Now, I've discussed this in detail, both with, of course, Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, also with other members of the leadership of UNRWA. I know that they are taking action on this, and rightly so. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Liam Byrne.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
The other one. I condemn this decision by the Israeli Parliament utterly. Tens of thousands of people have died through Israeli firepower, and now thousands more will die through an Israeli-induced famine unless the world acts. Will my right honourable friend confirm that if this decision is put into effect, it will be a breach of international humanitarian law, and a track record of honouring international law is required if we are to keep arms export licences open?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for raising this. We've been very clear about the role of UNRWA. As I've mentioned already in this debate, of course, it has that critical role provided for via the UN, not just in relation to Gaza, but also in relation to many refugees in the rest of the region as well. It is incredibly important. It is internationally recognised. And this UK government has already taken action to ensure that we are fulfilling our responsibilities on international humanitarian law. And again, I would refer him to the decisions that have been taken by this government in relation to arms export licences. Thank you.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In effect, the Knesset yesterday legislated for extraterritorial decisions over Gaza, the West Bank and refugee camps, and decided that UNRWA is an illegal organisation within Israel. What sanctions is the UK government going to take against Israel for that? And the one thing they will understand is if we suspend arms supplies to them, because it's those arms supplies that are being used to create the humanitarian catastrophe that exists in Gaza and is increasingly beginning to exist in the West Bank as well. If we don't do that, then British arms and American arms that come through Britain are complicit in the destruction of life of the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, we will continue working with our international partners and through the UN to press Israel to ensure that UNRWA can continue its vital operations. We know how important its role is. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to bore the House. I've already responded to questions about sanctions. We continue to keep those under review. But the honourable member will surely be aware that the UK government has already acted to suspend those arms licences, 30 of them, where it was clear that there could be a risk to IHL, international humanitarian law, being upheld, and where they could be used for lethal reasons in Gaza. So we have already put those measures in place because we take that responsibility to humanitarian law very seriously indeed. Thank you.
UNRWA. Deputy Speaker, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is horrific, catastrophic, and the Israeli Knesset has actually voted to make it worse. Without UNRWA, millions of Palestinians will lose life-saving food, medical treatment, housing, and much, much more. Now, I'm grateful that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the Minister of State have condemned the Knesset decision. But would the Minister agree with me that the fact that 90% of the Knesset voted for this decision, voted to ban UNRWA, is an indictment on the Knesset and also an insight into the value that Israeli parliamentarians place on Palestinian lives and therefore on human life?
Well, I would say in response to my honourable friend that the UK government, as I'm grateful she said, has been very clear on this. We do not agree with that decision of the Knesset. We believe it is wrong. We believe that UNRWA does have that very clear mandated international role in the region, which is particularly important right now in Gaza, given the extreme humanitarian needs. And we are very concerned, as indeed she intimated, about the potential impact of any harm to UNRWA's operations, whether that be in relation to the provision of food or of services, education, healthcare, the support that people in Gaza so desperately need.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Further to the very serious point raised by my honourable friend for Harrow East about UNRWA staff involvement in the evil attack on the 7th of October, terror infrastructure has been found in 32 UNRWA facilities in Gaza. We have seen a 3,000-strong Telegram group of UNRWA teachers openly celebrating the 7th of October attack. Israeli intelligence shows up to 10% of UNRWA staff have affiliations to terror organisations, and a Palestinian eyewitness has borne witness to the fact that he saw an UNRWA school director selling food meant for civilians at $100 a carton. It is clear that UNRWA is deeply infiltrated by Hamas. So will the Minister work with Israel and other allies to find another way to work with organisations that can be trusted to deliver aid into the hands of civilians and not into the hands of terrorists?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the UK government has been crystal clear. We expect robust processes to continue to be followed. UNRWA must meet the highest standards of neutrality, as indeed laid out in Catherine Clonner's report. That includes when it comes to staff vetting and also acting swiftly when concerns arise, as we have seen, in fact, taking place under UNRWA's leadership. And the UK has, as I mentioned before, allocated £1 million to support UNRWA in implementing the Clonner report's recommendations.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Another day, another outrage from an Israeli government that is treating the international community, international law, the UK government, and above all, Palestinian lives with utter contempt. Words are not enough. Actions are needed to force the Israeli government to end the war crimes and end the violations of international law. So when will the UK government impose on Israel the scale of sanctions it's imposed on Russia?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would refer my honourable friend to the comment that I made earlier, that of course this was a decision of effectively of Parliament, of the Knesset, rather than of the Israeli government. But the UK government has been very clear about our position on this. We instead believe that UNRWA has an absolutely critical role to play in Gaza, and we also believe and have acted on the basis that international humanitarian law is incredibly important. And my honourable friend, I am sure, is aware that the new UK government has been very clear about the fact that we believe there is a definite mandate for the ICC, for the ICJ as well, and we will continue to keep our sanctions regime under review.
Andrew George.
Speaker, the government have to accept that the far-right government of Israel are laughing behind their hands at us at the moment. They know that they're operating under the comfort blanket of a UK government that says it stands with Israel, that Israel has a right to defend itself. But when has murdering children in their hospital beds been tantamount to defence? In what way is the cold-blooded slaughter of 11,000 children tantamount to defence? Rather than condemnation and the use of words to condemn the actions of Israel, why doesn't she follow those many members in the House today and actually start taking sanctions, start taking action so that it makes the Israel government sit up?
Here, here, here.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Actually, the new UK government has been absolutely clear. The kind of unacceptable comments that we have seen from some Israeli government ministers are, as I said, totally unacceptable. The views that have been expressed towards Palestinians, both in Gaza and in West Bank, coming from some members of the government, are unacceptable. We could not have been clearer on that, both in opposition and indeed now in government as well. And he talks about action, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, not only have we been acting time and again in relation to the humanitarian situation, we will continue to do that, but we have also been acting to make sure that we uphold our responsibilities under international humanitarian law. And as I mentioned before, that has been very clear in the decisions that have been taken around the arms export licence regime.
Rachel Maskell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this month we've seen just 28 trucks in a day entering Gaza, and in the north, of course, none. And that leading to a catastrophic humanitarian situation. And in 90 days, we may have no infrastructure left in Gaza to be able to distribute that aid. So does she believe that this is a deliberate and systematic destruction of a nation, ethnic, racial or religious group with the intent to destroy it in whole or in part? And will she enlist the international courts to test that?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the UK government has been very clear that we are extremely concerned about the situation in northern Gaza that she referred to. We believe it is unacceptable that we are potentially going to be seeing the lowest level of aid being delivered this month since the beginning of the crisis, and yet the need is even more intense now than at any point. People's resilience is completely destroyed in many cases. So we're very clear about the need for aid to be provided, and we will, of course, also continue being absolutely clear about our adherence as a government to international humanitarian law.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Knesset's decision to brand UNRWA a terror group was very well signposted. So the question now is, what leverage is the government prepared to use to prevent this decision being enacted? Because I think we can all agree that another round of hand-wringing, head-shaking and soft-whispered words of disapproval will be as successful as they have ever been in the past. So may I suggest that perhaps it's time to summon the Israeli ambassador and tell the Israeli ambassador in no uncertain terms that if this goes ahead, then the UK will have no choice but to immediately end all arms sales to Israel, specifically those F-35 manufactured components on which their military campaign relies so heavily.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With all due respect to the honourable gentleman, I find the description of the UK government's communication of its views as soft whispering. Very surprising indeed. He surely cannot have failed to have seen the very clear concern expressed by the Foreign Secretary, by myself and by my honourable friend as well. That has not only been expressed through international deliberations and the fact that we have worked so clearly and strongly with allies around this, with the joint statement that was produced over the weekend, but also, of course, bilaterally as well. And the fact that the Foreign Secretary took this up directly, of course, with his counterpart in the Israeli government, I think is well known. This UK government, the new UK government, is determined to make sure that we are holding to international humanitarian law, and that is why we acted in relation to the legal requirements of the arms export regime, as I indeed described earlier. Thank you.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend, in response to my honourable friend from Brentwood and Isleworth, suggested that it was difficult to explore the motivations behind the Knesset's decision. But we have to be clear that UNRWA is being targeted because of its mandate with Palestinian refugees. The Knesset's vote will likely be devastating for life-saving aid operations. It is also a unilateral attempt to impact the right of return and make a two-state solution even harder. Does she agree that this is unacceptable?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for being crystal clear, as the UK government has been, that the UNRWA does have a clear mandate. It is one that is very obviously part of the UN framework, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and the wider region as well. We have stated that numerous times, and we are in concert there with our international partners in making that absolutely crystal clear. We will continue to make that clear, and it's critically important, as I mentioned before, Madam Deputy Speaker, when we see winter approaching, and we need to ensure that UNRWA can continue to operate without any impediment. Thank you.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you. The entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. These are the words of the United Nations Humanitarian Chief Joyce Mesu. The entire population of North Gaza. Madam Deputy Speaker, surely for someone so high up in the United Nations to be making statements of this nature, we can safely make the assertion that the onslaught on Gaza is genocidal in nature. The measure being intent, and not, as the Foreign Secretary alluded to yesterday, the volume of counter death. Will the government alter its position on this matter, and will it do by way of resolute action in order to ensure this crime against humanity is halted immediately? Words are not enough. Action is what is needed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I agree that words are not enough. That's one of the reasons why I met with Joyce Mesu when I was at the UN General Assembly, to make sure that we are working in concert with UN bodies on the humanitarian crisis and catastrophe that we see currently within Gaza. Now, we do need to ensure, Madam Deputy Speaker, that UNRWA is able to continue its life-saving work, and we need to see other life-saving measures being adopted, of course, as well. It was the UK government that pushed so hard to ensure there was leadership around the polio vaccination campaign, and we continue to push to ensure that those measures, which are so vital for those in Gaza, continue, and that we do indeed see far more aid going into Gaza than we see at the moment.
John MacDonald.
If I've got the government's argument correct, the argument is that there's a window of opportunity now between the decision by the Parliament and the implementation of this measure by the government. And yesterday, I think it was the member for North West Hampshire raised the question of what would be the consequence for the Israeli government if they go ahead to implementation. The message today, and I say this with regret to my honourable friend who I have a great deal of respect for because we've worked with each other over the years, the message today is that on sanctions, no additional sanctions, we're just reviewing them. On arms, we'll continue to supply the parts to the F-35. On trade, it was raised, the trade negotiations will just continue. On diplomacy, we will allow to remain in this country without any consequence the Israeli ambassador, who's an advocate of a greater Israel and therefore opposed to the UN position on a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Does she not realise the message that the Netanyahu government will be that during that window of opportunity, nothing will happen and they'll be able to act with impunity still? Can I ask her to go back and consult with their colleagues and come forward now with a series of actions that will have some effect in saving lives in Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I would say to my honourable friend that the message from the UK government to the Israeli government is actually extremely clear. It's been articulated indeed by our Prime Minister as well as Foreign Secretary and all those members of the government who have spoken on this. The world will not tolerate further excuses from Israel on humanitarian assistance. I stated that in my speech, and deliberately so. That message is a very strong message and it must be heeded.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fact is that Hamas are deeply integrated into the civilian and humanitarian infrastructure of Gaza, whether that's working through in hiding their soldiers in hospitals, as we saw this week, 100 terror suspects captured by the IDF in a hospital in northern Gaza, or in fact deeply integrated in UNRWA itself, as my honourable friend mentioned, a senior Hamas commander, clearly, who is working for UNRWA. So the fact is Israel is not going to facilitate the work of UNRWA in Gaza. So the question is, what is the government's policy? Is it simply to lament this decision and to criticise Israel and to threaten as yet unspecified consequences which are clearly not satisfying this House? Or is it going to do something practical to actually get aid in to the Palestinians? So working with Israel and with other partners to develop an alternative supply route that will actually get aid in and accept that UNRWA isn't going to be that mechanism.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, in actual case, the UK government has stated time and again that we expect robust processes to continue to be followed by UNRWA. And not only did we state that, as indeed the opposition did previously, we've done something about it because we ensured that some of our support to UNRWA is going towards ensuring that the recommendations of the Colonna report are implemented. We have seen UNRWA taking decisive and swift action when allegations have been made, and rightly so. That is right and proper. It would be for any UN agency, and especially including, of course, this one, given its vital role. He talked about practical measures. Well, we believe, when it comes to practicalities, to suggest that there is an alternative to UNRWA, given its depth of reach, given the scale at which it operates, is incorrect. It is the only body that can provide currently the infrastructure that's needed, and it is already mandated, indeed by the UN, by the international community, to do so. Thank you.
Paula Barker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The former Israeli Defence Minister, the late Moshe Dayan, famously once said, "Our American friends offer us money, arms and advice. We take the money, we take the arms, and we decline the advice." Regrettably, the same could now be said of Britain. I have every reason to believe the Foreign Secretary is making a very strong case for peace. But it seems to me, and millions of others, that the relationship with the Israeli government is entirely one way. So when will the government start using robust leverage above and beyond what has already been taken to ensure that Israel acts upon British advice as well as the advice from other international partners?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to my honourable friend, I would say that the UK government has not been intimating advice. We have been providing very clear injunctions, especially when it comes indeed to UNRWA and the need for its continued operation. And we have been always acting in line with our responsibilities around international humanitarian law, and we will continue to do so.
Lee Dillon.
Deputy Speaker. Last week I was joined with the United Nations Association in my constituency to celebrate the ideals of the UN, and were joined by constituents in Newbury Marketplace. Then yesterday I was shocked and appalled to see a fellow Member States Parliament start the process of banning a UN-mandated body. Given that the UK government will take over the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council this coming Friday, can I ask, Madam Speaker, what will the government do via that vehicle to demand that the banning of UNRWA is immediately undone?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I would want to pay tribute to his constituents, indeed for their support in multilateralism, more important surely now than ever. And we did see coming out of the UN General Assembly the Pact for the Future, which for me is a demonstration of that power, the fact that we can see multilateral action even in these deeply challenging times. Now, we will ensure that we are using our role in the UN Security Council to ensure that international humanitarian law is upheld, and also that we play our part as the UK in leading responses to humanitarian crises like the one that we've been discussing today.
Ian Byrne.
Mr Deputy Speaker. The member of Blackburn just said on Sunday, United Nations top humanitarian official warned the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. I actually spoke to the United Nations Special Rapporteur last week in person. He was in absolute despair about the lack of action from the world against what's actually happening in Gaza. Can I implore the Minister to give him and this House some reassurance that the government are actually reviewing how the sanctions are working and what else they can do to impress and force Israel into beginning to work under the humanitarian law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for having met with the UN representative. I know that many people in this House have been seeking to engage with multilateral organisations involved in this situation, and of course the UK government has been doing so repeatedly in relation to all of the UN agencies that are involved. Of course, the World Food Programme as well, UNICEF also, with whom I have directly discussed this situation, as well as UNRWA itself, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to pay tribute to all of those who are engaged in this manner, as well as, of course, to all the charities and other bodies so engaged, including UK Med, who are doing an incredibly important job. And we will continue to make sure, as a new UK government, that we do all that we can to ensure that international humanitarian law is upheld here, as in every other context, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of the 12,000 UNRWA employees, around 1 in 5 is a member of Hamas, almost 500 of them of Hamas's military wing. When I asked the Foreign Secretary if he could guarantee that UK taxpayers' money would not go via UNRWA if there were any links to Hamas, he did not answer my question. So I'll ask the same question to the Secretary of State today. If the Right Honourable Lady able to give the UK taxpayers a guaranteed assurance that Hamas has no links to UNRWA in aid delivery in Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, when it comes to the views of the UK public and of UK taxpayers, I think it's absolutely critical here that we reflect on what's taken place over the last few days, where we've seen very many Brits actually stepping up to provide their support to that DEC humanitarian appeal for the Middle East. This clearly is of great concern. Of course, it's important that wherever there are allegations of activity which is not neutral, particularly some of the appalling allegations that we saw related to the 7th October attacks, that they are fully investigated, and UNRWA, when it has been provided with that evidence, has investigated, has taken swift action, and of course we will continue to do all we can as the UK government to ensure that remains the case, and that has included, as I mentioned before, providing funding so that the neutrality reforms that UNRWA itself wanted to implement for some time are indeed being implemented and followed. Thank you.
Andrew Pakes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last night I spoke to constituents of mine who support medical aid directly into Gaza and the West Bank. They were angry and heartbroken because after each of the conversations I've had with them in the past year, the bombing and destruction has increased. So I welcome the statement by the Prime Minister and my honourable friend about the situation. But the vote in Knesset risks making things worse for aid, for the release of the hostages, for a two-state solution and for the recognition of Palestine. So can I ask my honourable friend, what hope can she give to my constituents, the Palestinian people and the world community that this time it will be different?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I thank the constituents to which my honourable friend referred, some of the many Brits, as I mentioned before, who are deeply concerned about the situation. And indeed, I would wish to pay tribute for a very brief moment to all those UK medical staff who are directly engaged in Gaza. I've had the incredible honour of meeting with some of them, and their work truly is life-saving in extremely difficult, perhaps the most difficult circumstances we can imagine. I agree with him that this decision by the Knesset is deeply counterproductive for Israel itself, as well as, of course, being very harmful to UNRWA itself, to the delivery of humanitarian aid, and indeed to the UN system as well.
Tom Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of colleagues in this House, I was appalled at the decision made by the Knesset yesterday. This is a humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are displaced. They're now without homes, they're now without water, without food, without healthcare. If UNRWA is banned, what practical steps can this government take to make sure that aid gets into Gaza and, more importantly, those people who need it get it?
Minister.
Well, I agree with the honourable gentleman's characterisation of the situation. We really do need to make sure that life-saving supplies of water, of sanitation, of food, of shelter do get to those in need in Gaza. And the particular concern around the situation in northern Gaza has been made clear by other members during this debate. We are very clear as the government that UNRWA plays an absolutely critical role. It's one that cannot be replaced, actually, by other organisations. So we will continue to be very clear that its mandate must be supported and that it must be able to continue to operate.
Tracy Gilbert.
Speaker, the vote in the Israeli Knesset is deeply worrying and will result in further suffering, starvation and deaths in Gaza. Will my right honourable friend outline what urgent steps the government are taking alongside international partners to get more aid into Gaza?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for asking this very important question, because we do need to see more aid entering Gaza. It really is needed. Many members in this debate have referred to the fact that winter is coming, but of course we have not seen enough aid entering even over recent months, and it looks likely, as I mentioned before, Madam Deputy Speaker, that October may be the month where we've seen the lowest level of aid actually entering Gaza since the conflict began. We're very clear that any restrictions on aid are unacceptable. We have been working with international partners on this. She will have seen the joint statement that we released over the weekend, and that is part of a whole series of actions we've taken with partners bilaterally and in multilateral organisations to make sure we're playing our part and that the UK is offering leadership on this.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A few weeks ago, I asked the Foreign Secretary and sought assurances from him in relation to children being killed after being given the polio vaccination. The ministers made mention of polio vaccinations undoubtedly being given by staff members working with UNRWA. We have seen over or close to 1,000 civilians killed since I sought that assurance from the Foreign Secretary a few weeks ago. We'll all recall that young teenager burning in that tent, alive with an IV drip. Given the current state, will the Minister agree that all of the diplomatic and political levers that we talk about are falling on deaf ears, and the only real thing that this government can do is to put words in action? Sanctions, trade sanctions, embargo on all licenses, and the recognition of a Palestinian statehood unconditionally.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the UK Government's position is very clear. We have advocated, in the Foreign Secretary's case, since the first hours, indeed, that he was in office, for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, for the release of hostages and for the aid to be provided in Gaza that is so clearly required. There's no question about that position that we have been so crystal clear on. He referred to the impact of the conflict on healthcare staff. I would also draw his attention to the fact that we've seen more humanitarian workers killed in this conflict than in any other conflict, in fact, currently that we're seeing around the world. We have taken action. We do believe that the UK must fulfil its responsibilities to international humanitarian law, and I believe that he can see that very clearly, for example, in the decisions that have been taken around the arms export licence regime. Thank you.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the humanitarian collapse in Gaza and the risk of mass starvation, this vote is obviously deeply dangerous for the Palestinians. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that it also sends a deeply dangerous signal internationally to civilians in conflict zones, where other states who have been accused of violating international humanitarian law may take succour from this vote and target UN agencies providing that life-saving aid?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making this point. Now, the UK and our partners have been clear, as we've discussed this afternoon, that the Israeli government cannot continue restricting aid, nor indeed should any other government or any other warring parties internationally. Unfortunately, we do see a number of violations of international humanitarian law. We just had a discussion previously in this chamber about the situation in Sudan, where we've seen restrictions on aid. They are unacceptable. Civilians must be protected in war, and the UK government will continue to advocate very strongly indeed for this.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for the answers and for her clarity as well. Much appreciated. Does the Minister accept that Israel has not taken this decision lightly, but bases it on intelligence gathering which indicate an infiltration of Hamas within UNRWA? And does the Minister further agree that we must work to find a solution to see charitable foundations are free to provide the aid so desperately needed? And that whilst the UN has a role to play, will the Minister liaise with Israel to determine how we can get the help on the ground to those who need it throughout Gaza and Israel? Thank you very much.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for his questions and, as ever, for his sincerity around these issues. Of course, the UK government will continue to work with charitable foundations and organisations. There are a number of them, including many, in fact, which are based in the UK, which are providing incredibly important support for the people of Gaza. However, we are clear that when it comes to the delivery of aid in particular and of services, there is no other organisation that can fulfil the role that UNRWA performs, because of the need for that scaled support, that deep support, but also because of its critical mandate that has come from the UN. Thank you.
James Frith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join the government in condemning this decision by the Israeli Parliament. Does the Minister agree with me, if we step back from this, that cutting ties and undermining UNRWA at such a time with this decision not only leaves us aghast at a time when the very institutions we will need working effectively, independently and without prejudice to build any prospect of peace and a future after a ceasefire and the return of the hostages, and that worst of all, this ban further compounds the misery for the Palestinians and those of us still hopeful of a two-state solution?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and for the longer-term perspective that he has just taken on these critical questions. We do agree that this decision, if implemented, would be deeply harmful, not just currently, given the humanitarian catastrophe that we see, but also in the future. We will continue to work, as we just discussed, for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed. But as and when that ceasefire is achieved, when we see that cessation of hostilities, it will be incredibly important that reconstruction then continues. And in that process, of course, we will need to see UNRWA and other UN agencies involved, as well as other regional countries, a number of different partners that will need to be engaged in that very important effort of rebuilding, one which, of course, the UK government has discussed with many partners.
Paul War.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Has the Minister seen the latest letter from the Commissioner General of UNRWA, which states unequivocally, today, even as we look into the faces of children in Gaza, some of whom we know will die tomorrow, the rules-based international order is crumbling in a repetition of the horrors that led to the very establishment of the United Nations? And does she agree with him too that the implementation of the UN mandate may become impossible without decisive intervention now by the General Assembly and by UN Security Council members?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I've discussed these issues directly with Director General Lazzarini, as he would have expected, as well as with other members of the UNRWA leadership. I do agree that we need to all act to do what we can to preserve the rules-based international order. And in terms of the UN General Assembly taking action on this, I spoke for the UK when precisely this matter was discussed at the UN General Assembly in New York just a couple, well, actually maybe about 3 weeks ago. Thank you.
Steve
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course, it's incredibly concerning that the Knesset is pursuing legislation to restrict UNRWA's work. I wonder if the Minister agrees with me that the international community needs to put in place mechanisms both to fully monitor and incentivise the implementation of the colonial reforms in order to assure and give comfort to Israelis and to Jewish communities in the UK that UNRWA staff will never again be able to participate in terrorism.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I appreciate the very considered question that my honourable friend has just asked. The Clona report itself and the work that has been undertaken since has focused on how we can ensure that those reforms, particularly related to neutrality, are indeed implemented, but also then continuously reviewed so that we know that that neutrality is carried out throughout the organisation. Now, in terms of the UK Government's engagement on this, we have supported this financially with that £1 million contribution. We believe that is important, and we will continue to discuss this with UNRWA and indeed with other multilateral bodies and bilateral partners in the future.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that the way to stop this conflict is to get the hostages released? And in this respect, would she be able to explain to the House what connections there have been through diplomatic channels with those who are holding the hostages so that we can get them released? And I believe this would end the fighting.
Minister.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend that we must see the hostages released, and I know many of us have been thinking about the immense pain of the families and friends of the hostages who have now been in captivity for such a long period. Incredibly concerning situation, and the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have met with a number of the families of the hostages. So if I, of course myself, as one would expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to do all that we can to be very clear that the hostages must be released, to advocate for that continuously, and also for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, and for the aid to be provided into Gaza that again is so desperately required.
That concludes the urgent question, and I'll just give a few moments for the front benches to settle.